Thank you, Gordon and Paul. Can you hear me? Is the microphone working?
Yeah.
Yes, brilliant. So, as you've gathered, I'm here to talk to you about insects, why they're really important and cool and beautiful and fascinating, and the troubles they're having, and most of all, most importantly, what we can do about it. And I'll talk a little bit about farming and a little bit about rewilding, and then I'll mainly talk about what we can do in gardens and urban areas. I should say thanks particularly to Paul for tempting me up here. He sent me these photographs of these amazing insect costumes, and I just had to see them in real life. So tomorrow afternoon, I believe we're doing some strange things in... Where are we doing it?
Tomorrow afternoon, David will be a bombus terrestris.
Apparently. I'm slightly nervous, but anyway. Well, there'll be some other insects too, I hope. It won't just be me.
Hancock.
Brilliant.
From 11 till 3.
Marvellous. Okay, so I've been interested in insects all my life, since this isn't me, this is my youngest son, Seth. There he is, with his pet cockchafer, Colin. Sadly, Colin is no longer with us, but anyway, Seth is still in his insect phase, and just like I went through a kind of insect phase when I was only 5 or 6 years old, I got really into... I hunted for caterpillars and grasshoppers and trying to keep them alive, and most of them died, poor things, like Colin. But I learned a lot, and I was lucky that I never grew out of that kind of insect phase, and I hope Seth never does. But the reality is that most people, by the time they're teenagers or adults, their reaction to anything that buzzes near them is fright. They start flapping around, they try to kill it because they think it's going to bite them or sting them or something. And look at this. I mean, honestly, this just says it all to me. We sent this, the University of South Wales, in case you can't read the small writing. I was sent this picture a couple of weeks ago. I mean, honestly, what kind of message? That giant red warning sign, flying insects in the area. Oh my God, there might be a bee or a butterfly. And actually, it was just swarming ants, flying ants. That's what caused this consternation. Yes, words fail me, really. Anyway, so insects, of course, are actually amazing creatures that we should cherish. They're incredibly biodiverse. They've been around for about 480 million years, which makes them twice as old as the oldest dinosaurs, which has given them a lot of time to radiate, to speciate into just an incredible number of different types. We know of about 1.1 million species of insect, but new ones are being discovered all the time, and it's variously estimated that the grand total might be 3, 4, 5, 6 million. We don't really have a clue. But isn't that mind-boggling to think of all the amazing beasties that we haven't yet discovered, that are still out there, that we know nothing about, that we haven't even seen yet? Really cool, I think. And it does make me wonder why we spend so much time looking out and spending millions investigating space when we haven't even discovered what we have right here yet. And sadly, of course, before we've even discovered them, we are losing insects. And I don't want to dwell on this too much because it is grim listening. There's a lot of evidence from all sorts of different sources showing that insects are in decline. One of the more dramatic studies was from Germany, which showed that the biomass of flying insects fell by 76% in 27 years. We are undoubtedly losing our insects fast. That said, most of them we don't have really good population data for, but we have things like maps that show a similar pattern. So I'm just going to give you one example of an insect in decline here. This is one of my favourite insects. This is the shrill-carded bumblebee, which is a southerly insect, was never very common this far north. But you can see pre-1960 it was pretty common. In the south of England, this was an everyday insect. But as time has gone on, it's dwindled. And by the time I got interested in trying to understand what was happening with rare bumblebees, it was about the year 2000. And at the time I was based at Southampton University. And I went to, Gordon reminded me to use the mouse to point at things, because then the recording can tell what I'm pointing at, rather than me waving my hands around. I'll probably forget. Anyway, just for the record there, look, the mouse is on Salisbury Plain. That was the nearest population surviving of this rare beastie. And I went to see it, and I spent the summer searching around for this rare bumblebee. And I eventually found 2 or 3 of them. I got really excited the first one I found. They have they're called the shrill carder because they have a high-pitched buzz, which you can kind of get your ear in for eventually. But anyway, sadly, since then, that population on Salisbury Plain has gone extinct. And the one on the Somerset Levels, just to the west, seems to be about to go extinct. So this bee has gone from being a widespread insect when I was born in the 60s to teetering on the edge of extinction. And this could easily go in our lifetime. And it will within 10 years, perhaps, who knows, if we don't do something. And this is happening right now, kind of on our watch, in our lifetimes. And it's something we jolly well need to wake up to. Because, of course, insects are really important. They kind of make the world go round. I mentioned the 1.1 million species. That means they comprise about 70% of all life that we know of on the planet, in terms of numbers of species. But they perform all sorts of important functions. So they are food for a big swathe of the creatures that aren't insects, things like birds and bats, and lots of reptiles and amphibians and freshwater fish like trout and salmon. They all depend on insects. So if the insects do become more scarce, as they have, that means less food for all these other creatures, and they're going to disappear in turn. Insects also do tons of other stuff that's really important. Sometimes scientists talk about ecosystem services to describe these things. So, for example, they help to control the pests of crops. Initially, the pests are also often different types of insects, so they're not all particularly helpful to us. They're recyclers of all sorts of organic materials. So the dung beetle, top right, dung beetles and dung flies help to clear away cowpats and recycle the nutrients that would otherwise be left in them and release them for new plant growth to provide fodder for livestock to eat and so on. Beetles and flies help to get rid of dead bodies. Insects help to get rid of trees, tree trunks, leaves, all sorts of stuff. They help to keep the soil healthy. They distribute seeds. They're basically involved in more or less any process you can think of on land or in fresh water. There aren't really any insects in the sea, interestingly. Most of this goes on without anyone really being aware that it's even happening. Most sort of average man in the street hasn't got a clue about dung beetles or any of these other creatures. The one thing that they might know about insects is that they pollinate. They may incorrectly think that only bees pollinate. I think some people think that just one species of bee, the honeybee, pollinates everything, which is wildly untrue. Pollination is actually delivered by a whole swathe of different insects, including all the bees, wasps, butterflies and moths, lots of different flies, beetles and so on. There was one recent estimate that suggested there's at least 6,000 pollinating insects just in the United Kingdom. But between them, they're obviously performing a really vital role. 80% of all plant species on the planet are pollinated by insects of one type or another, so would ultimately not reproduce and would die out without them. And of course, you've probably heard these figures before, roughly 3/4 of the crops we grow in the world won't give a full harvest, some give nothing at all, without pollination by one type of insect or another. So we've become used to our supermarkets being kind of awash with this amazing produce from all over the world available for 12 months of the year. But if we didn't have insect pollinators, it wouldn't look so good. Things like apples, cherries, strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, pumpkins, tomatoes, I could go on and on and on, but even things like coffee and chocolate depend on insect pollinators. So, I mean, the horrible truth is we couldn't feed everyone on the planet without insect pollinators, certainly not a healthy, nutritious diet. So we do have a really selfish reason to want to look after them and to want to avoid ending up like these people. Forgive me if you've seen these pictures before, they have done the rounds a few times, but I think they're kind of worth repeating because they show people in southwest China hand pollinating their apple and pear trees. It's an area of big orchards, big commercial orchards, where there are so few pollinating insects left now that the people take little pots and collect pollen with a paintbrush and then manually pollinate every flower, and they send their kids climbing up to do the higher branches. China, the labour's pretty cheap and this is a high value crop, so it's still just about economically viable to do that, but it's hard to imagine a British farmer out in his field of oilseed rape with his paintbrush trying to pollinate it. It's not really going to work. So we really ought to look after our bees and other pollinating insects. So there's really strong, selfish reasons to look after insects because we need them. They do stuff that we depend upon. And I trotted this argument out so many times over the years. And it's true, but something started to nag at me about it, that it wasn't really encapsulating why I care about the decline of insects. I don't like insects because the economic value of their pollination is worth $220 billion a year or whatever somebody calculates. I care about them because I kind of think they're cool and I like them and I don't want them to die and I don't want my children to grow up in a world without these things. And it worries me that there are insects that probably don't do anything terribly useful from a human perspective, but does that mean they're expendable? Like the poor old giant earwig of St. Helena. So this, I mean, it looks really big up here. It's not 3 inches long, which is still a pretty big earwig. Sadly, it's extinct. It was only ever found on this little island in the South Atlantic. We think they were wiped out by rats that we accidentally introduced to the island. And so it quietly went extinct. It hasn't been seen since the 1960s. We only know it from a few specimens with pins through them, which is rather sad. But there was no ecological disaster unravelled when it went extinct. It wasn't doing some vital thing that anyone or anything depended upon, as far as we know. But it still seems to me that the world is a poorer place without a giant earwig, even if none of us were going to go there and ever see this beastie. And likewise, I think all life on our planet should be respected and deserves to live, doesn't it? I mean, these and millions of other creatures have been here for millions of years, most of them much, much longer than us. And we talk about human rights, but what about insect rights? What about the rights of species to survive? I think that's something we ought to at least think about. Okay, so that's most of the doom and gloom. There is a little bit more, actually, but anyway. I'm now going to move on to the solutions of the insect crisis. Now I'm going to focus on 3 areas, as I mentioned at the beginning. I'm going to say a little bit about farming, which is a huge topic that I can't really do justice to. It needs a whole lecture in itself, and probably given by somebody other than me. And I'm going to talk a little bit about rewilding, and then I'm going to talk mainly about sort of urban rewilding, wildlife gardening, if you like. But we'll start with farming, because it is actually the biggie, I think, in many ways. You know, you could argue that the biggest challenge facing mankind right now is not what to do about Putin or whatever, although that obviously is a big deal, or how to get the economy growing again so that we can pay off the huge deficit we seem to have. But more fundamentally, how are we going to feed everyone without destroying the planet? Because that really is a biggie. And there's going to be 10 billion of us before too long. And the way we're feeding people at the moment, if we carry on down the same route, then we will all starve, because the current industrialised farming system, I don't think, is sustainable for a number of reasons, three of which are kind of encapsulated in pictures here. So firstly, the biggest driver of biodiversity loss around the world has been the industrialisation and spread of monoculture cropping, big-scale agriculture with lots of chemical inputs, lots of pesticides, lots of fertilisers, creating something close to a perfect monoculture where there used to be rich biodiversity, as in oil palm plantations in Borneo or a field of wheat in Northumbria. So industrial farming is basically undermining its own underpinnings. It needs pollinators, as I explained earlier. It also needs all those other insects to help control the pests and to keep the soil healthy and so on. So if it's wiping them out, then how's it going to function into the future? It's also doing terrible damage to soils. There's a recent report from the United Nations that 40% of the world's soils are now badly degraded. What are future generations going to grow their food in if we don't leave them soil? We absolutely have to look after the soil that remains. It's taken tens of thousands of years for it to form, and it can be gone in a day if you leave it vulnerable to heavy rains or whatever. And then thirdly, food production as we currently practice it contributes about 35% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which we know we have to stop somehow. So I would argue that the kind of current system is broken. I could come up with other criticisms as well, but that will do for the moment. So what's the alternative? Is there a better way of doing all of this? Well, if you kind of step back and think, okay, what would be the ideal way? What would the perfect farming system, what are the principles it should kind of hold to? Then I've kind of listed them there. I think it obviously needs to feed everybody with a healthy diet, but it also absolutely has to look after the soil. It needs to look after biodiversity. I think it might sound a bit hippie, cheesy, whatever, but it kind of needs to work with nature. It needs to use natural enemies to control pests rather than trying to spray everything with pesticides. It needs to make sure there are adequate populations of pollinators and all these other organisms that it depends upon. And that might seem like quite a long shopping list, but actually there are types of farming that seem to offer all of this already. And I haven't got time to tell you in any depth about all of them. But all of these have similar principles: massively reduced or no pesticide inputs or fertilizer inputs, usually much greater diversity of crops, usually perennial crops, at least on some of the land to hold the soil together. And so on and so on. I'll tell you a little bit more about biodynamic farming, which is kind of intrigues me. It's kind of like organic plus. It's basically organic farming with a little bit of witchcraft thrown in, which from a scientist's perspective is slightly unnerving. They make preparations by stuffing flowers and whatnot into a cow's horn and burying it. And then a year later they dig it up and make some sort of infinite dilutions and sprinkle them on the crops. And you think, well, this has got to be nuts. And maybe it is, but if you actually look at everything else they do, it's really, really sensible. And if you go to a biodynamic farm, and I've visited a few in recent years, they're teeming with wildlife. They're full of bees and butterflies and birdsong, and the soil is black and full of worms and really rich and healthy. There's one close to me where they grow 47 different crop varieties, fruits and vegetables, on that farm. It's a 180-acre farm, and it employs 28 people, which is about 28 times as many as a farm of that size employs on average normally. Sells its food through its own farm shop to local people, so it's all low food miles and everything else. basically it seems to work. It's looking after the soil, it's supporting biodiversity, and it's producing loads of food. If you measure their yields, it's very similar to conventional farming. So it is possible to kind of have your cake and eat it, it seems to me. And I think we should really be investing more research and development and financial support in these alternative approaches to farming. Anyway, that's all I've really got time to say about farming. I'm now going to skip on to a kind of related subject, which is not everybody's cup of tea, which is rewilding. And I know some people hate rewilding. I've never fully understood what the issue is, but it's a bit of a Marmite subject for some reason. Anyway, let me tell you what I think rewilding is and why I think there's a place for rewilding in this country and elsewhere. So I first came across the concept with regard to Yellowstone National Park, and forgive me if you know this example already. There's a really nice video by George Monbiot on YouTube which explains it in much more detail than I've got time to go into here. But basically, Yellowstone National Park is an absolutely massive national park in the United States. And up until relatively recently, it was in a really poor ecological state. It was absolutely overpopulated with what the Americans call elk, which are basically red deer. There were millions of them, and it was terribly overgrazed. There was little vegetation. The soil was eroding because of that. Trees couldn't regenerate because any sapling just got eaten as soon as it germinated. It was in a state, and they took the decision to reintroduce wolves as a possible solution to the problem. Wolves had naturally lived there, but had been shot out a couple of 100 years earlier by hunters. And the story goes that they introduced, it was only a dozen or so wolves, it wasn't very many, in an enormous area, not enough to actually eat a significant number of elk. But it changed the behaviour of the elk, which is really kind of interesting, and the elk started herding together in open areas and keeping away particularly from steep slopes and riverbanks where they could easily be snuck up on by the wolves. Which meant that trees started to regenerate along all the rivers, which meant there was more food for beavers, and the beaver population then rocketed up, started creating more dams and more habitat for wildlife. And there was this whole cascade of positive benefits from having replaced one missing kind of keystone animal, the predator, from the ecosystem. From a UK perspective, sadly, nobody is yet seriously talking about introducing wolves to England, at least. There has been talk about it in Scotland, possibly. From a UK perspective, it's a bit different at the moment. So when I was at university, I remember being taught that the whole of Europe, including Britain, was covered in dense forest prior to people coming along. And that idea was kind of supported by the fact that if you left a patch of land in Britain and didn't manage it at all, it would turn into an oak tree forest pretty quickly, or a forest of tall deciduous trees. But that did sort of beg some big questions, like we have lots of wildlife that only thrives in open areas, that can't live in woodland, lots of butterflies and orchids and all sorts of other plants and animals. Where did they live if it was all dense, if the whole of Europe was covered in a dense forest? It doesn't quite make sense. And anyway, so as some of you will know, many ecologists have come round to a slightly different view of what the landscape looked like before people came along, which was that it was probably more open than we used to think, because it was occupied by big herbivores, things like the auroch, the ancestor of the cow, and there would have been ponies and elk and red deer and pigs, wild boar truffling about. And even only just 115,000 years ago, there would have been elephants wandering around the landscape. In evolutionary terms, that's the blink of an eye. Wouldn't it be cool to have elephants back? But anyway, that's perhaps not entirely practical. So rewilding in the UK has focused primarily on restoring missing herbivores, big animals that can help to maintain a kind of slightly more open and biodiverse landscape than we would have otherwise if we just fenced off an area and left it. And the project I know best, it's a long way from Newcastle, unfortunately. It's down in West Sussex. It's called the Knepp Estate. which is a 3,500 acre estate, which was intensively farmed until about 20 years ago. It's on really heavy clay soil, so it wasn't producing much food, and in fact it was heavily subsidised, as are all big farmed estates. But despite heavy subsidy, it was losing money. And the owners of the estate decided to take the rather kind of extreme change in direction of rewilding the whole estate, so which in essence means they put a fence around the outside and they took out all the internal gates and fences. They chucked in some longhorn cattle that can live on their own without any real husbandry all year round. They put some Tamworth pigs in because they weren't allowed to release wild boar. Some Exmoor ponies, they released some red deer. And then the idea is to just step back and say, okay, we're not going to manage it, we're not trying to steer this, we don't really care what happens, we just want to see what nature does left to its own devices. They did chuck in a couple of other species as well, more recently. Beavers, which is very exciting last year, and the white storks, which was a few years ago, which are now thriving and nesting at Knepp if you do get the chance to go down there. Anyway, to cut 20 years rather short, from my perspective, it's kind of worked. If you go to Knepp in the spring or summer and go for a walk, it's teeming with life. You'll hear nightingales singing. They have the second biggest population of nightingales in the whole of Britain, having had no nightingales before. And one of the main reasons is because there are tons of insects for them to eat. They're insectivores, as are the cuckoos, which you also hear loads of. And cuckoos have become almost absent from lowland England. They have turtle doves you can hear purring in the distance, which are all but extinct again, but are thriving at Knepp. And from an insect perspective, there's loads of life. They've got the biggest population in the whole of Britain of the purple emperor butterfly there. And they didn't have any purple emperor butterflies 20 years ago. Even this year, they even found the large tortoiseshell turned up, which was supposed to be extinct in Britain. I'm slightly suspicious as to how it turned up at Knepp. But they're claiming it was a natural event. Who knows? We'll probably never know. But one way or another, this is a place that's full of biodiversity. And it seems to me that we could do more of this. We can't rewild the whole of Britain. We need to grow food. The most productive land should be farmed. Will have to be farmed if we're going to feed everybody. But in places that are really unproductive, on poor soils, surely instead of flogging away, heavily subsidising production of a small amount of food at great environmental damage, instead supporting biodiversity and carbon capture and recreation, because thousands of people go every day to Knepp during the spring and summer to walk and experience all this wildlife. That seems like a pretty good trade-off to me, and I think I would love it if government supported more projects like this. Okay, finally, the third and final topic I'm going to talk about, which is the one that's probably most relevant to most of us, because sadly, few of us have 3,500 acres to rewild. I wish I did, wouldn't that be cool? But anyway, but many of us do have some kind of garden or outdoor space, or if failing that, can try to influence the management of communal urban spaces, parks and so on. And I think this is a really exciting area. Just to throw some figures at you, there are about 22 million private gardens in the UK. And they cover an area of about 400,000 hectares of land, which Megan McCubin mistakenly said on Springwatch was a bigger area than all of our national parks. It actually is nowhere near as big as our national parks, but it is a bigger area than all of our national nature reserves put together. And just imagine if most of those 22 million gardens were wildlife friendly. That would be a lot of resource for wildlife. And if, better still, we could persuade the local council to come on board, so that the city parks were full of wildflowers, and the streets, the road verges, the roundabouts, the cemeteries, every bit of green space we could find was full of wildlife. And that would be a national network of wildlife-friendly, insect-friendly habitat, and that would really make a difference. I haven't got time to go into all the things we can do, so it's kind of going to be a few highlights here. If you want to know more, I have written some books, sorry to plug my own books, at least one of which is available outside, or my YouTube channel is available. Anyway, so we think of gardening as a green activity. What could be more green more environmentally friendly than growing flowers to encourage butterflies or growing vegetables or fruits or whatever. But sadly, not all gardening is particularly green, at least not in the environmental sense. It might be quite bright green to look at. But while many of us are trying to rewild our gardens, there is, unfortunately, a movement in the opposite direction. We've seen, particularly since lockdown, a boom in sales of plastic grass. I really loathe the stuff. I mean, what kind of garden is that? It's awful. And look, that is a plastic hedge. You can buy plastic hedges. I mean, again, words do slightly fail me at this point. I mean, what you can get plastic. I saw online you could buy plastic wisteria to nail to your house, which flowers for 12 months of the year. What's not to love? I hope most of you don't. Hopefully, there's nobody here. I won't ask for a show of hands. Who has a plastic? Please don't. So that's pretty obviously not great for the environment. I could rant on at length why plastic grass is bad, but I'll spare you. But actually many of us are guilty of a slightly, of doing environmental harm as part of our gardening in a slightly less obvious way. So many of us have probably at some point driven to an out-of-town supermarket, out-of-town garden centre, one of these giant places that so many have all over the country, and got a trolley and gone walking around the aisles. And there are lots of things you might put in that trolley. You might put some annual bedding plants grown in disposable plastic pots, probably in a peat-based compost, almost certainly treated with fertilisers and loads of pesticides. And you might get a sack of peat-based compost and put it in the bottom along with some, why not have some Roundup to kill the weeds and some Bug Clear to kill the insects. These are all things that sell in huge quantities from shopping centres all the time. And of course there's big negative environmental impacts of that. But on the other hand, gardens can be amazingly biodiverse places if we avoid that kind of commercial approach to gardening and we're a bit more relaxed about it. And there's a really nice example of just how biodiverse gardens can be. From Leicester, there's a lady there called Jenny Owen who wrote a book called The Wildlife of a Garden. She spent 35 years trying to identify every species of animal and plant she could find in her garden. It was only 1/8 of an acre. It's not a big garden. It's quite near Leicester city centre, so it's a very urban area. But nonetheless, her species list, you've got to give her top marks for spending 35 years doing this, her species list was 2,673 different species of animal and plant in her little garden. 1,997 of which were different types of insect. But isn't that extraordinary? I mean, that strikes me as the sort of, biodiversity you might expect in a patch of rainforest or something, not in urban Leicester. And it just goes to show that we could all have thousands of species living in our back gardens if we just do a few simple things to encourage them. So what are those magic things? I'm going to highlight a few of the things we can do and a few things we might not do. Starting with one that not everyone agrees with, but I think the scientific evidence is reasonably clear that where possible, growing native plants is better than growing non-native plants. There are big exceptions to this, particularly in terms of pollinator attraction. There are some non-natives that are spectacularly attractive to pollinators, and there are some native plants that hardly attract any pollinators at all. But on average, the two particular studies, one I've been involved in, this one, which you can access online, it's open access, and that evaluates the numbers of insects attracted to 111, I think it was, different plant species and varieties. There was also one conducted by the Royal Horticultural Society, and both studies concluded that native plants tend, on average, to be a bit better for pollinating insects than non-native plants. It's not a huge difference, but there is a difference. And these are just three from the study I just mentioned, the three best native wildflowers in terms of the total number of insects attracted per year to a square metre of that plant. You've got marjoram on the left, you've got Viper's bugloss in the middle, and greater knapweed on the right here. Please don't all rush off and fill your gardens with those three things, because that would be really boring, but they're just some suggestions of plants you might try to grow. They all look really beautiful. They're native wildflowers, but they look lovely in a garden setting. So these are good for pollinators, but actually the real advantage of planting native plants where you can, and I'm not suggesting you should rip out all your non-natives from your garden or whatever, but where you can, squeeze in natives, not so much to benefit actually the pollinators, but because they benefit herbivorous insects, which make up a much larger number of species than the pollinators. So just to give you an example, that of course is the orange-tipped butterfly, which is a gorgeous butterfly, native species that may turn up in gardens. If you plant some lady's smock or some garlic mustard, two cabbage family plants, then there's a really good chance that the female will come and lay eggs in your garden, and you can have your own little breeding population of this gorgeous butterfly in your garden. If you don't plant one of those two species of plant, you can absolutely guarantee you won't have breeding orange tips because they won't eat anything else. And likewise, every native plant species you add to your garden will support several species of herbivorous insects. The herbivores are much fussier about what they'll eat than bees are about what they'll drink. And to take it to an extreme, if you plant a native tree like an oak tree can support at least 280 different species of insect. Whereas if you were to plant a eucalyptus tree from Australia, it will basically support absolutely nothing apart from a big fat pigeon. So go for the natives where you can. Speaking of which, what about weeds? This is a kind of, for some people, a controversial topic. Keen gardeners have often been kind of brainwashed into thinking that some plants are undesirable aliens. And it often seems to me quite an arbitrary selection of plants. These are three plants that are normally characterised as weeds that you shouldn't. You're a bad gardener if your gardener is full of. If your lawn is full of dandelions, then that's incompetence on your part. But dandelions are, I think, kind of beautiful, and they're really important nectar resource in early spring for hungry bumblebees and so on. Likewise, thistles and ragwort. They're all really actually among the most attractive plants to pollinators that you could grow in your garden. I've got all of these in my garden, and they don't actually take over at all. The ragwort looks really nice in a flower bed. So it would be great if we could kind of urge people to be a little more tolerant of some of these native wildflowers. You can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just like that by just renaming them wildflowers, because that's what they are. I did come across this really lovely initiative in East London somewhere by a lady called Sophie LeGill, who was trying to highlight the diversity of weeds growing in the cracks in the pavement in her local borough. And she did surveys, and she found 47 different species of plant growing in these little cracks. But what was really cool was to highlight that to passers-by. She chalked the names next to each plant to make people sort of stop and realise these plants they were literally standing on biodiversity. I thought that was rather cool. Unfortunately, in many urban areas in Britain, you're more likely to come across this kind of thing. This, of course, is the result of the local council spraying herbicide on what they deem to be weeds growing around a tree. Many local councils literally employ teams of people to drive the streets looking for something green, and if they see it, they jump out and kill it. What is that all about? Does that look nice? I think that looks awful. It's kind of just like mindless environmental vandalism. And I mean, aside from the biodiversity impacts, which is one thing, but there is a more sort of a sinister side to this, which is that the chemical used, Roundup, almost invariably, is the active ingredient is glyphosate. The World Health Organization says glyphosate is a probable carcinogen in people. It's hotly disputed. The manufacturers, Monsanto, insist that it's not a carcinogen, of course, because they want to keep selling it. But nonetheless, the evidence does seem to be quite strong, and yet we spray it in our streets. I've seen it being sprayed on children's play equipment in the local park. Why would we do that with something that's a probable carcinogen just to be tidy? It seems really, really strange to me. I think we should ban pesticides in urban areas completely. We don't need them in gardens. I've got a 2-acre garden and I grow lots of stuff and it's all fine without using any pesticides at all. The council don't need to be spraying them in our streets. And if you don't believe me, then look to France, because France banned urban pesticide use completely in 2018, and Paris is still standing. It hasn't been overrun by dandelions and cockroaches. So if Paris can be pesticide-free, why can't Newcastle be pesticide-free? Why can't London be pesticide-free? We could do it easily, and this seems like a really easy win. There's no big downside to getting rid of urban pesticides. Probably you don't spray pesticides because you've come to a talk about insects, so I'm guessing you're probably reasonably well disposed towards them. But there are at least 2 other ways you might accidentally bring pesticides into your garden. One is, we did some research a couple of years ago now, where we went to all the local garden centres, big chains like B&Q, and we bought the plants that were being sold as perfect for pollinators or bee friendly or whatever. We specifically bought the ones that were badged as being good for wildlife. And we tested them for pesticides, and 98% of them were positive for at least one pesticide. 75% of them contained insecticides designed to kill insects in the nectar and pollen. One little heather plant had 10 different types of pesticide in it. Why was that necessary? It seems grows pretty well on its own, heather. Anyway, just beware that those beautiful plants in your local garden centre, they're really tempting, but they're almost certainly dosed up to the eyeballs with a whole bunch of different poisons. One final thing to watch out for, which not many people are aware of, but I've been trying to flag up in recent years, is that, so you might have heard of neonicotinoid insecticides. They're neurotoxins. They're really, really poisonous to bees and all insect life. Tiny, tiny doses. They're like Novichok for insects, if you like. They were banned in farming in 2018 or across the European Union because of the evidence that they were harming insect life. But you can still buy them and drip them on your dog or cat. How strange is that? So Apricot is a neonicotinoid insecticide. This is a slightly different insecticide, which is almost as poisonous. So neither of them good. And the dose that you're supposed to drip prophylactically on the neck of your dog to stop it getting fleas, if you follow the advice of your vet, is enough to kill 60 million honeybees. And these are long-lasting, persistent, water-soluble chemicals. So if your dog goes out and gets wet, it's going to drip off on your lawn. If it jumps in the pond, then there's going to be a huge dose of insecticide going into your pond. If it goes in the river, the canal, whatever. And I've got a PhD student studying this at the moment, and she has found that 100% of English rivers are contaminated with at least one, and usually both, of these dog flea treatments. So beware if you have a dog or a cat, which I know many of us do. If you want to know more about what you could do instead, talk to me afterwards. I've got some ideas. Okay, I need to wrap up fairly soon-ish, but I've got a few more little things to cover. One is a really obvious one that I think everybody who's interested in wildlife gardening is aware of. Mow less. We don't need to mow. Why is this strange obsession with straight lines up and down like a Wimbledon tennis court in your garden? What is that all about? It seems like a waste of petrol and sweat when you could, instead of getting the mower out of the shed, get a deck chair and make yourself a gin and tonic and sit, lie back and enjoy it. Because you'll find that most lawns will burst into flower if you just stop mowing the hell out of them all the time. And it's not just, of course, our gardens that we have lawns, but there are loads of mown areas in road verges and so on that don't need to be mown anywhere near as often as they often are. The traditional management is to cut road verges about 8 times a year. But they don't have to be close mown, boring grass. They could be like this. This is one road verge that's been planted with wildflowers. And doesn't that look so much better? And wouldn't it be brilliant if every road verge and every roundabout looked like that? Which brings me to the subject of seed meadow mixes, flower mixes. Because there's quite a lot of confusion as to what is the best mix to sow. And this is quite a complicated subject, and I haven't got time to do it more than a very fleeting kind of give it a quick discussion, but there's a couple of things that I think are important to bear in mind next time you're planning on sowing a wildflower meadow or patch in your garden or whatever. there are roughly 3 different common seed mixes that are widely available. And the first one I'm going to mention is this one. They're sometimes called pictorial meadows. You might not have heard of them, but I bet you've seen them around urban areas. They planted huge amounts of these kind of mixes around the Olympic venues in 2012 in East London, and they got huge acclaim because they're really colourful. These mixes are very colourful annuals that flower in the first year, just a few weeks after sowing them, and create this amazing floral display. They're often sold as wildflowers. It actually says wildflower on the packet, but these are not native plants, most of them. They're a whole mishmash of things from California and China and a few European plants mixed together to give maximum colour. And they do provide food for bees. They're not disastrous for wildlife at all, but they're pretty hopeless for all the herbivorous insects I mentioned. And I think it's wrong to call them wildflowers, because that to me implies that they're native, and these are definitely not. Then the second mix you might sow is an arable weed mix, which is really colourful. Things like poppies and cornflowers and corn marigolds and corn cockles and so on. Again, they flower really quickly in the first year, and they look really colourful in the first year. But like the other mixes, the mix I just talked about, they will disappear after the first year, very largely. These arable weeds probably came in with Neolithic farmers many thousands of years ago. So some people say they're not native. I think that's been a bit pedantic, really. They've been here since Neolithic times. I think we should give them the benefit of the doubt. But anyway, those work, they're pretty, they're sort of native. By all means grow them, but they're not what I think is the meadow habitat we should really be cherishing and trying to recreate where we can, which is this, our kind of perennial hay meadow mix, which we used to have in Britain, huge areas of this. We had about 7 million acres of flower-rich hay meadows in the United Kingdom in 1930, and we destroyed 97% of this habitat by 1987 in just 50-odd years. It's full of clovers and vetches and trefoils and yellow rattle and all sorts of other species, and it supports loads of different insects, both herbivores and pollinators. And you can get mixes. They don't produce quite as much colour as quickly as the other mixes I just showed you. But this is a really, really valuable habitat, and I think, particularly if you're sowing seed mixes in the countryside, then we should be doing this kind of thing rather than the other two that I just showed you. Okay, so to wrap up, I think we kind of need to try and rewild ourselves a bit if we can, and well, as it says there, learn to respect and love nature, to stop seeing nature as a commodity that we can just use up as we see fit, and realise that we are part of nature, we're not separate, and that our well-being and that of our children depends upon looking after nature and respecting it. If you stop to think about it, it's extraordinary. We live on a rock hurtling through space with a little crust of life clinging to its surface. It's completely extraordinary. You know, it's been said many times, there is no planet B. It's everything we have. Elon Musk has this idea we're all going to go and live on Mars. We're not. We should look after what we have, surely. And it's really, I find it completely bizarre that we're so reckless with this amazing planet that we have. And it worries the heck out of me that, you know, my kids, and if I ever have grandchildren, they're going to inherit an impoverished world and have a much harder life because we've been so reckless. You know, we would all do anything, wouldn't we, for our children, apart from apparently leave them a decent planet to live on. Surely we can do better than that. And what better place to start than by looking after all the little insects that live all around us. Thank you, everybody, for listening.